5th of November 2018. Before we start our main session, we felt it was really appropriate to send our condolences to the family and friends of Lord Hayward. As Jeremy Hayward, he served 4 Prime Ministers and, of course, appeared in front of this committee, not too often, which was, I think, one of the clever things about being a good head of the civil service. But when he did, he was a consummate professional, and he has quite rightly been highlighted by those 4 Prime Ministers, particularly as an outstanding and skilled public servant, and a public servant who had those skills tested on many occasions, not least of all in dealing with BrExit in recent months and years. I know he was held in high esteem by all those who worked closely with him, including those of you here today, and I think those warm tributes from the former Prime Ministers speak for themselves, so our thoughts are very much with his family now. But today, and I'm sure he'd want us to carry on challenging you about how well you as public servants are delivering, we're here to look at the UK border and its preparedness for exit, not our first foray into this, and of course a number of you have appeared in front of other committees as well. We remain concerned about how ready the UK is to cope, and the National Audit Office report doesn't really do a great deal to allay those fears. But today we want to very much focus on the practical impact on different aspects of the economy, because we've got the National Audit Office report, we've got the previous work and the evidence you've been giving to other committees. So we want to drill down into some specific areas, and on which point I'm going to hand over to Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown to look at agriculture and animals.
Right.
Sir Geoffrey.
Good afternoon. Ms Moriarty.
Sorry, I forgot to introduce the witnesses, forgive me. From my left to right, Karen Wheeler is the Director General for Border Coordination at Revenue and Customs. Welcome to you. John Thompson, Permanent Secretary at Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs and a frequent flyer here. And Claire Moriarty, really often here, the Permanent Secretary at the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. And Paul Lincoln, the Director General for Border Force at the Home Office. Welcome back to you. Sir Geoffrey, apologies.
Ms Moriarty, good afternoon. Let's start with phytosanitary checks. Since the referendum, your own plant health register has added 153 serious diseases that affect plants. And yet, at paragraph 16, it says, DEFRA intends not to apply regulatory or safety checks on any of the major agriculture and food-related products and other goods arriving from the EU. Isn't this going to be a charter for every rogue producer in the EU to import plants that have got diseases in them?
Well, we are absolutely committed to maintaining the very high standards of biosecurity that the UK has, and we are certainly not in the business of reducing that level of protection. I think if you go back to what we're looking at here today, this is about what we would do in a no-deal situation, and particularly right at the start of a no-deal, where we have to weigh up the importance of maintaining flow against in the context of a thorough risk assessment. And as we've discussed when I appeared before the committee 3 weeks ago, there isn't an instant step change in the level of risk of plants and plant products coming into the country. So we're taking that into account in the regime that we'll be operating. But we are intending to make sure that we control the same level of risk, and we would expect over time to extend the checks that we apply to or pre-notifications to imports from the EU. But on the first day of a no-deal exit, we don't think that the actual level of biosecurity risk will be different to what it is the previous day.
Do you not think that criminal behaviour, the criminals will soon work this out, won't they? That there aren't checks being carried out properly and they will alter their behaviour accordingly? That is absolutely part of the risk assessment that we are then building into. How quickly can we then move to different arrangements? But within the EU, there are regulations governing the way in which seeds are propagated and plants are plants and animal products are produced, and so we won't see a sudden change in that. We certainly do need to recognise that people might try to exploit and take advantage of a perceived different regime, and that's why we have to balance how quickly can we move to a new regime without causing imports to fall over against the need to bring in but to be able to staff and man and organise properly
future controls.
I mean, I hardly need to remind you that foot and mouth came in on a ham sandwich and eventually ended up costing the government and the industry £8 billion. So resources put into this area could be very cost effective.
And we are absolutely, as I said to the committee when I appeared 3 weeks ago, we are absolutely committed to maintaining our biosecurity, and we will expect to make changes over time. So that which we do on the 29th of March 2019 in a no deal is not that which we would expect to be doing some months or years later. But we have to be pragmatic about what we can cope with, so that what we don't want to do is to create an environment where suddenly we can't bring in necessary food products into the country.
So how long do you think it will take you from now, irrespective of whether there's a deal or whether there isn't, to get a phytosanitary inspection system that is up to the job?
We are recruiting additional phytosanitary inspectors at the moment, so that is an area where we are increasing our resources in order to be able to manage the system properly. The exact point, the exact point at which we will have particular measures in place, no, the honest answer is we have to work that out, looking at our understanding of the movements that are happening. At the moment, we are focusing very much on making sure we can manage.
Short answer to the question is you don't know.
The short answer to the question is it is something that we are still working on.
Can I just ask how long it will take to recruit these inspectors? To train them?
Well, we're recruiting, I think, about 109 inspectors. We've recruited 57, and so we're continuing that process.
And when they're recruited, are they ready to go day one, or do they have to be trained?
They do have to be trained, but what we're trying to do is to put newly recruited in the areas where the training requirement is least and release people with more training.
And how long's the limit that training?
I would have to check. From my recollection is some of the training can be completed in about a 3-month period. That may not. We may then need to make sure we deploy our resources to put the most experienced.
Okay, you could write to us just to confirm that.
Yeah.
So figure 1, page 14, says out of the 270 crossing points in the UK, there are to be no major checks at 207 of them. Surely every rogue in Christendom will know where to get diseased plants and diseased animals into this country.
We are looking at. We are doing a piece of work at the moment to understand where the major points of entry are for DEFRA commodities, and there are 22 major points of entry at the moment. So we are focusing our efforts on those at the moment.
Okay. Paragraph 322 on page 37 says that, obviously, clearly, and we've discussed this before, there will be some rerouting of exports. Have your ministry considered the possibility of animal welfare implications of that? Because if live animals are having to travel longer distances, there must be a possibility of animal welfare being compromised.
So when we talk about rerouting of exports, we're very much talking about non-live animal exports. The scale of live animal exports is very small. There are 4,000 live animal exports a year, compared with 250,000 sheep per week slaughtered within the UK. And again, as I think I said to the committee the last time I was here, we have a very close control of all movements of live animals for export, and before any operator can move live animals, they have to submit a journey log to the Animal and Plant Health Agency. That is assessed and improved, and animal welfare is absolutely front of mind when that process is going on. So we would not be approving any rerouting that we felt compromised animal welfare.
Okay. How far advanced are you with your discussions with other government departments, HMRC and Transport, in prioritising key food goods which may be perishable, or even live or dead weight animal exports, which clearly need to be prioritised and not delayed?
So that's a discussion which is starting across government, and colleagues may want to chip in. So that there is an understanding that the Dover Straits, in particular, the Ro-Ro ports, are where a lot of the perishable food comes in. and we need to make sure that we've got the right mechanisms in place. But that's really how we fit in, how food fits into a broader picture. So it's probably might hand over to. Yeah.
I mean, that answer, to be frank with you, sounds a little concerning, because when the supermarkets and other shops are relying on just-in-time food chains, not only is there a risk that the food will pass its sell-by date, but there's a risk that actually the shops will not have the supplies that they need. I mean, I would have thought this was one of the highest priority areas for BrExit to be considered.
So it absolutely is, and it is very much the subject of discussions across government at the moment. So there's been a lot of analysis to understand where food is coming in. So about 10% of food products come in, of our food consumed comes in through the Dover Straits. So we need to understand what of that can be rerouted, what the how we make sure that we are giving adequate priority, but also how we support the very complex, it's a very sophisticated supply chain in food. So it's not something, we aren't controlling all of that ourselves as government. What we're trying to do is to support the logistics companies, the retailers, all of the people involved in the food supply chain to make sure that they can bring food in.
Thompson, this is a really important matter. I mean, even that 10% from Dover, if there's a significant disruption to food coming into this country, will mean shortages on the supermarket shelves. What more? I mean, you're both chairman of this cross-border committee. What more can your committee do to ensure that this doesn't happen?
So to be fair, it's not Claire who's jointly chairing it, Shona Dunn, who's the second permanent secretary of the Home Office. But perhaps I can answer your question one back, if one might. So the question of prioritisation only arises because of two prior steps. The first of those, I think Claire has set out, which is you need to do an assessment of the capacity loss which might be plausible in the event of day one no deal. That work has been done and given to ministers about what might be the impact on capacity across the short straits. You then, and as part of that work, we've been looking at what might be alternative routes for traffic to flow. You secondly then have to make a decision about should the government intervene in that market or not, and ministers have yet to make that decision. Then thirdly, if you decide there is a reduction in the capacity and if you decide the government ought to intervene, that only then do you get to your question about what would be a prioritisation methodology. So ministers have considered the first of those steps, but yet, and I've seen some early work on intervention and prioritisation, but are yet to make any decisions.
Maybe any discussion being had with the NFU or anybody else? If this foodstuffs or animals are delayed through no fault of the farmer or the exporter or the haulier, is the government liable for any compensation?
We're in very regular discussion with the National Farmers Union and other bodies. I think it's, in a sense, as Mr Thompson was saying, you go back a step because it's not necessarily a question of food being delayed. It's a question of how the market responds and whether or not particular types of food are transported through particular methods. This is not an area where the government would expect to be paying compensation. But what we do need to do is absolutely to work with this very diverse supply chain to provide all the support we can to make sure that the arrangements are in place.
Mr Thompson, can I move you rapidly on, because we've got an awful lot of ground to cover this afternoon, to chemicals, and ask you if a chemicals regime has been, maybe you or maybe it is your response, your Minister DEFRA is responsible for chemicals. Has a chemicals regime been agreed yet? If not, how will the REACH provisions work? Because if the UK hasn't agreed it, how is the continent going to grant REACH licences for chemicals to be exported?
So again, we talked quite a lot about REACH when I was here a few weeks ago. So there are two cases in point for REACH. One is what happens to UK companies who are exporting chemicals to the EU, and the other is companies who are importing chemicals from the EU. So in relation to companies who are importing chemicals, we are effectively setting up a mirror regime and a mirror registrations process so that companies who have previously, because if they've only imported chemicals from the EU, they won't have needed to have a registration so that they can register. We are giving them an amount of time after the 29th of March 2019, should there be a no deal, to provide the basic data and then a longer period to provide the full dossier which you'd expect for a registration system. But so companies who are importing will be able to continue importing. They will have, depending on the nature of the products they're importing, either 120 or 180 days to provide further information, then about 2 years to provide the full dossier. For companies who are exporting chemicals, they will need to re-register with an EU 27 address. Either if they're part of a broader company group, that may be the address of another company within the group, or via what's called an only representative, which is effectively an agent who holds the registrations. So they will need, as a company, to change their address within. They will have a registration within the EU system, and they will then need to change the address on that registration. That is a technical process. We have had quite a lot of engagement with the EU chemicals.
We must try and keep the questions and answers brief. A chemical company will have to register under the EU REACH regulations, which is likely to take some time. So there will be a gap, if you like, and that surely will hit small businesses exporting chemicals particularly hard.
These are companies who already have a registration, but where they need to change the address on the registration. So that should be a technically relatively straightforward process, but it's an unusual process. The engagement we've had with the European Chemicals Agency suggests that they are planning to open up the capacity to do that in time for the companies who need to do that to complete that process.
The smaller category, those companies that have not exported before, how will they work?
So I think I may have to in all these multiple cases, I may have to check exactly where we are on that. But my best understanding, as I say, we did go through this in quite a lot of detail last time, is that we don't anticipate that there will be a problem with companies being able to continue both to export and import, provided that the European Chemicals Agency is able to process the relocation of the registrations.
Not much has moved on since 3 weeks ago, but we recognise this is an important area. Just before we move on to Bridget Phillipson, I just wanted to check, if I were a farmer in Sir Geoffrey's constituency, for argument's sake, and I wasn't going to get an export licence because you're worried about queues of lorries and therefore the goods wouldn't get through, the live animals or even the dead weight and the refrigerated lorries couldn't get through in time. Have you done any modelling to see what would happen if that livestock's not able to be exported or sold? What would happen to the British market? How it would distort it, whether it would affect the imports we'd have from other countries?
Can I again separate out the live exports from the carcass weight? So live exports, as I say, are individual journeys are individually ratified. For exports, we are standing up the mechanisms to be able to for people to get the export health certificates, which they will need in the new system. We are also talking, as again, I mean, we said last time, we are looking at what the implications might be if there is an impact on exports and how we might need to support the farming industry. I'm not yet able to say to you this is exactly what we're going to do, but that's certainly an area that we are looking at.
You've got a conclusion on that? You haven't done any modelling to see whether you're going to have extra livestock on farms that would reach the point where it needed to be slaughtered and sold, or enter therefore the British market? We're starting to do the modelling. I mean, clearly, if exports are reduced, then there will be an impact on livestock. Part of the question is different types of livestock. What's the point at which you can make decisions about? So, when will you have? Well, you won't understand until it happens. How prepared are you to deal with those challenges?
Well, I think we will be prepared to deal with the challenges. Some of it is about understanding what messages we might need to give. So some forms of livestock, you can, in a 3-month period, you can decide how much you're going to rear. So poultry have got a relatively short life cycle. So we're looking at, as we do with everything, sector by sector, to understand what the implications might be. But we do absolutely understand the potential impacts for farmers.
What health certificates? They're anticipated to increase by 300%. You're not knowing how many resources in staff you're going to get, let alone vets. Isn't this going to be a major problem?
We don't think we will have a problem issuing export health certificates. There is, of course, a trade-off, because if we find that the difficulty is in exporting because of the flow through the ports, then we may find that we have a smaller impact on export health certificates. But we have hardened and strengthened an existing system for export health certificates. We have recruited people, and we are reasonably confident that neither the export health certificates nor capacity in the veterinary market will be a constraint. The Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons have agreed this week to the proposition around non-vets being able to be part of the process for issuing export health certificates.
Thanks very much. The car industry is vital to the UK economy. I just wondered what work has been undertaken by HMRC with reference to the car industry and its supply chain so that they're prepared for any changes that might be needed.
So we've done quite a bit of work through a third party with chemicals industry, with the food industry and with car manufacturing in order to understand from them the very practical impacts of what day one no deal might mean. And indeed Karen and I visited a major car manufacturer last month to see what the practical impact of that would be. The reason that we focused on those three particular areas is because they are generally the areas where the tariff can be highest or where free trade agreements are subject to the most negotiation. So I think we have given ministers a very clear understanding of what it would mean for the car manufacturing industry if there were to be a day one no deal, and if the EU therefore charged its common external tariff on imports and on exports. That has all gone to ministers yet.
Beside the issue of tariffs, on the issue of non-tariff barriers, even a small increase in paperwork in the sector could lead to major issues and a drop in productivity. What work's been done around the issue of non-tariff barriers, but also, you mentioned no deal, but I'm also keen to hear the impact of the various scenarios that could result, not just the no deal scenario.
Okay, sorry, my misunderstanding. So in relation to deal, of course, the government's preferred option, and we ought to say this at least once in the course of this committee, is clearly to strike a deal which is largely set out in the white paper. I know you know that, but for the record, if we go through this entire committee and don't say the government's preferred outcome is to strike a deal as set out in the white paper of the free trade area. So I've recorded it
okay,
once,
Mr. Thompson,
right?
we've got that right.
So I don't need to say it multiple times. We're okay with that.
So that's fine.
Look, under that deal, then the white paper sets out the combination of four things really: the facilitated customs arrangement, no tariffs, a common rule book for goods and agriculture, and market surveillance. In which case, that doesn't really have any impact on the car manufacturing sector. And again, as I said, when we visited a well-known car manufacturer, they were really clear about that. In relation to the no deal, then we would then potentially different regulatory arrangements apply, but that clearly is not the government's preferred outcome.
So you're saying there's no impact on the car industry from the other scenarios other than no deal?
From the deal.
From the deal. So what would the impact...
I'm
just trying to understand what you just said there. So setting aside no deal, looking at the various scenarios that could result following the government's preferred model and so on, what is the likely impact, if any, on the car industry and its supply chain?
So my understanding from the extensive time that we spent in the factory recently was very little, if any, impact on the car industry. But Karen may want to add to it.
I was only going to say, obviously, if the non-tariff barriers, that is what they were primarily concerned about, and that would be removed if the deal did include no friction with EU trade. I mean, clearly, depending on the shape of a deal, there would be different possible impacts on them, but they weren't things that they were particularly worrying about when we spoke to them.
I mean, naturally, we're all concerned about the impact on the major players, but it's the supply chain down the line who may be less prepared for what's happening. What conversations are HMRC having with small and medium-sized businesses involved in the sector about their preparedness for where we are?
In the car manufacturing, you're still staying with car manufacturing.
Yeah.
So we've been through the primes to understand their concern, and there clearly is some concern about, in the event of no deal, what might that mean for the viability of companies in the supply chain, particularly in relation to managing cash flow.
And what's the level of engagement been like from the SME sector? Have you found them as prepared, as engaged in what's happening as the bigger players? No. Could you expand?
Do you want me to say? I mean, I think what's fair to say is it's obvious we have tried to reach out to trade rep organisations which represent the smaller organisations. The smaller organisations are obviously, they have less corporate infrastructure and capability to be able to think about and plan for exit. Therefore, the trade rep organisations are our best route into that. But also the primes, as with the major manufacturers, are highlighting the implications for those organisations. There is no doubt that what they're all saying is there are significant impacts for smaller organisations. We're not able to directly engage with them in the same way. There are obviously many thousands of these organisations. We're trying to do that through the trade rep organisations and through the primes. But that's...
Mr. Whitson.
I'm also concerned to understand the likely impact on regional ports around any additional barriers that may present themselves in the event of the different scenarios. So much is said about the impact on ports in the south, and that's right, and we'll no doubt cover that in more detail. But what conversations are being had with HMRC in terms of the impact on regional ports and the regional roads network around difficulties that may arise?
We have already been talking to, jointly with Border Force colleagues and other departmental colleagues, to every port and airport across about 135 we visited to talk about the potential impacts. We're honing in on those which have the biggest impacts. Obviously, we already have a lot of contact with Dover, Eurotunnel, and so on. But with all of the ports, whether it's Humber, Immingham, Harwich, Tilbury, Holyhead, all of those ports. So we are following up with further conversations so that they can understand exactly what the implications are likely to be, not just for the port itself or the airports, because the same is true of airports, but for their immediate stakeholders and potentially for their customers.
Transport and Highways England involved in those conversations?
Certainly Department for Transport is, where we also think if there are potential impacts on transport. So, for example, in addition to the southeast ones, Holyhead, for example, and Portsmouth are two that we're particularly concerned about. And we are therefore also trying to ensure that we've got the conversations not just with the ports, but with their local resilience forums, including Highways England and other stakeholders in the locality.
Because I was concerned about the impact of the Port of Tyne in particular around some of what may happen, the volume of cars being exported, the importing of parts. So I wrote to Highways England to ask them about what work was being undertaken there, and I appreciate you can't speak for Highways England. But I was a bit alarmed and surprised to hear, while they talk about the investment that's going into the strategic road network in the North East, that a Brexit-related port traffic assessment work has not been undertaken. This is largely because the outcome of the negotiations has been and remains uncertain, as are the ramifications for business and society. Trying to predict the impact will be very challenging. They then talk about the impact on the work that's being done with the Department for Transport around Kent in the South East. I was just surprised to hear that there wasn't that work going on across the country. Understand the impact. There may be no impact on the North East, but I was surprised to hear that work wasn't happening.
We definitely have had a visit to Tyne, Port of Tyne, and it probably hasn't been in the top, it's certainly not amongst our top 12 priority ports and locations, but we are organising some follow-up discussions with them because, as you say, those other ports, and particularly Ro-Ro ports, all do have degrees of impact, but it depends very much on the volume and the frequency of the sorts of trade flows as to how great an impact it is.
I think we ought to, if one might indulge me, get some actual data in the room so that you just understand the sheer scale of this challenge for us. So There are, in 2016, DFT statistics, I think, said there were 2.6 million movements in and out of Dover, 1.6 million across Eurotunnel. The third biggest port is Holyhead at 500,000, and the fourth largest one is Portsmouth, 165,000, and then there is a long tail of ports after that. So we've focused essentially on where the big volume is, and we have to be realistic about how far can we go through that long tail. So I just think it's worth understanding the sheer enormity of the big two, and then, as Karen said, we focused on the top 12, but we can't realistically focus on all 135.
I understand that there are pressures and the time pressures involved, the volume of the work required, and that there's a need to look at the areas where there is the largest throughput. But at the Port of Tyne, you're talking about over 400,000 cars being exported in the last year alone. It's a major import centre for Hitachi Rail Europe, for Komatsu. You know, this is significant, and I was just concerned to know just how much joint working there is between HMRC, the Department for Transport, Highways England. I appreciate this does not all fall to you to resolve, but it requires coordination across departments to sort it out.
Definitely all of the meetings that we are organising with all of these ports, as I say, we've been round there once already, and there will be some follow-up work, is definitely a joined up activity with not only HMRC but also DFT, Border Force and DEFRA where that is appropriate as well. So we certainly are doing that. I can't point to exactly what we discovered to be the impacts at Port of Tyne, but I can take that away and we'll be following it up.
Final question, Chair, on the freight industry. I just wondered what engagement there had been with the freight industry, how prepared they were, whether guidance had been issued, and just the state of play.
So we meet with the freight industry, the main stakeholder organisations, Freight Trade Association, Road Haulage Association, logistics organisations, warehousing organisations. We have a logistics steering group that they come to, and we meet with them every month and have done for the last year. So they are very sighted on the issues. They, of course, have a degree of concern associated with this because they are the key organisations that sit between the ports and the traders. They are, of course, concerned because they take their, the freight organisations obviously take their instructions, as it were, from their customers primarily, and so to the extent that their customers are or are not getting ready and prepared will have impacts on the freight and road haulage. So they're absolutely inside the all of our discussions. I've certainly been to various conferences as well to talk about them, and they're a key group and route for us to engage with the wider sector.
So last week the government published, I appreciate that, but last week the government published this document. It's called a Partnership Act, preparing for changes at the UK border after a no-deal exit. That was published last Wednesday. That has 15 sectoral analyses in, which includes the and it's been distributed through our network of approximately 180 different organisations that we talk to, which includes the Road Haulage Association, British Retail Consortium, and so on and so forth. So that's been widely disseminated.
Interesting that you say that, because we've had Madeleine Moon, who's the Member of Parliament for Bridgend, has raised concerns about just-in-time deliveries in particular, and talked about meetings called with 2 days' notice for a 3-hour meeting with a cross-border delivery group for a day one scenario planning workshop. When you talk about meetings, this sort of thing worries us. We hear it from our constituency too. Are you giving people the proper time that they need to prepare?
Obviously, we are trying to do that, and that's why we set up some of those regular steering groups a year ago, nearly 18 months ago for some of them, and they get plenty of notice for those. However, we have also recently, relatively recently, had a series of workshops with automotive, with the sort of agri-food sectors, specifically to talk through and test whether the arrangements that we're trying to put in place do work for them. And it may be that some of those meetings have not given them adequate time to prepare, although we do try to give people as much notice as possible. But we don't just have one-off meetings, we do have follow-ups, so there is plenty of time for people to engage either before or subsequently to those meetings.
I think we ought to broaden out the Chair's question, if that's possible, which is, will business... We're not going to be naive about this. about will businesses be ready for day one no deal. Customer readiness is one of the three big risks here, and that includes the entire border industry that is currently rated red in terms of how we see it. Customers will largely, to some degree, will not be ready for what would happen in the event of day one no deal.
Mr. Chapman?
Ask, I mean, one of the great strengths of the Scottish economy is their ability to export. And, you know, I think Brexit gives us a whole range of different concerns that, you know, are top of our agenda. I'm just wondering, in terms of, you know, how critical that is to the economy, you know, what contingency plans might be put into place should, you know, for example, Dover be log jammed at some point, or if we don't have the you know, are there any other port facilities that you've looked at in Scotland, for example, that could provide us with alternatives to Dover or ports through the southeast?
Yeah, so we are obviously looking at the range of scenarios. These arrangements and these scenarios that you're talking about in terms of constraints on Dover and the Channel ports arise not because of the controls and checks that we're putting in place, but because of those that member states, and particularly France, obviously, will put in place to meet the EU requirements and regulations. We know that the EU will require them to treat us as a third country, and in those circumstances there will be full customs controls and agri-food type checks. What we don't know is exactly how they plan to implement arrangements to enable flow of goods through those arrangements. So clearly what we're working through is a range of assumptions about what those might be.
The Dutch, for example, are doing quite a lot of work on their side of the channel, of the sea.
Yeah.
So you're saying you don't know what's going to be planned because they're planning everything in the infrastructure.
We absolutely have a better idea of what Zeebrugge and Rotterdam are doing, and Dublin Port, and we indeed know largely what the Calais Port is planning and Eurotunnel are planning, because we talk to them all the time. What we don't know is what French officials will require in terms of customs controls and checks that have to be carried out.
Okay. Then you don't know about the French.
No.
We know.
No,
we don't know. We don't absolutely know what any of those countries will do.
But you're
in terms
better.
of
You
their
know better.
officials.
You know more about what they're doing than about.
Well, yes. Well, I think we take more assurance on the Zeebrugge and Rotterdam side, simply because they have talked about, and we understand that they do have proper automation and systems, and they are of course international ports which deal with rest of the world goods all the time.
So that's the difference. Rest of the world.
That is the
difference?
critical difference.
Right.
They have systems and infrastructure.
Right.
Whereas Calais and
Right.
Eurotunnel only ever have dealt with the EU.
Right. Okay.
And
yeah. So Mr. Chapman, come on.
In terms of that as well, though, I mean, it sounds like, a bit like passing the buck to the other 27, but if we just take what you've said at face value, what kind of discussions have you had with, for example, some of the devolved parliaments and assemblies, and in particular Scottish Government, over what the implications might be of Scotland not being able to export through one of the ports? Again, it's been...
You can't, I'm sorry about this. You can't say that we're passing the buck to the French. If the French government decides to be legalistic about checking everything that's leaving France, right?
Sounds like...
No,
so,
but you,
on the issue of...
I'm sorry.
I couldn't hear Mr. Chapman's question.
On the issue of the discussions that you've already had with the Scottish Government, where are you with that?
we do have a Scottish steering group that has met on a number of occasions. So it isn't necessarily to Scottish Government, it is the Scottish Government officials that we have had several meetings with to talk about the impact on their ports and their airports, and how these arrangements might impact them. So we have had those conversations and are starting, obviously, to talk to them as we are to others about the potential impacts of contingency in respect of impacts on the Channel Straits.
So have you visited in Scotland?
We visited all of the ports and airports. I can't tell you, but I think there are about 33 ports and airports in Scotland. I haven't got the list in front of me, although I can give that to you. But it is all of the ports and airports.
Ms. Wheeler, if you could tell us when you visited them, because I think one of the things we're picking up from colleagues around the House is often these are very late meetings. We know you've got a lot on your plate, but it would be helpful if you could write to us.
Indeed. We started this round of physical visits to all of the Scottish ports and airports in July.
Country, it's not just those ones. If you could write to us with a list of when you met.
Yes, absolutely.
Can I just move on to more generally on the port preparedness? I've had the chance to visit a number of the ports, not recently, but a lot of them have problems with the physical infrastructure. We've touched on this before. Many of them privately owned, will not invest in bigger physical infrastructure. Some places nowhere to put it. So, have you had any? Is there any improvement? I mean, the NEO report says there's lots of stuff still to do. Can you update us on where you're at with that physical preparedness about where you put goods if there is a problem about flow?
So one of our almost starting assumptions when we started on this many months ago was that even then it was not going to be possible to create and implement significant infrastructure changes at all of the ports.
She was in front of us, but we're talking about putting things down the road. So, I mean, down the A55 off Holyhead's quite challenging.
Indeed.
In Larne, it's very challenging. We know that I don't need to go through geography of every port. We know that a lot of them are challenging.
Yes.
So, what's the latest?
So we are still working through. So on day one, as it were, as in March, we are not expecting that any of that infrastructure. It is the same as last time and the same assumption. Well, I mean, obviously, apart from trying to work out exactly how we will deal with customs controls and so on at all those locations without that infrastructure, which has been progressing, but
since last time, what's different if you're sitting in front of us now compared with last time? So
we have now, with HMRC and others, worked through exactly how we will deal with freight arrangements, for example, and control processes without any additional infrastructure. There has been some...
So what does it mean? Does it mean you're letting things through without checking? Does it mean that you're doing automated checking, pre-paperwork? What's the...
So, for example, for freight going through ro-ro ports, which don't have that sort of systems or infrastructure, we are not going to have customs controls stopping the freight at the border. There will continue to be security controls and checks on that freight to the same degree that there is today. That doesn't change, but there won't be additional customs controls happening at the border. What we are anticipating is that for the highest risk trade that comes through those routes, they will be directed to inland facilities.
Built.
The inland facilities will be available on the beginning of December.
Do you have a list of where those are going to be and what they are?
Two locations.
One in Heathrow and one in Milton Keynes.
It's a long way inland then. This is not down the road from the ports.
This is not a big deal because we've had a logistics contractor that can move the goods as we do now.
Holyhead to Milton Keynes.
Just to wind back a bit about why. The reason
we do know why. Yeah.
You know why?
Yeah, we covered this last time.
Because the deal or no deal is a binary choice. So why would you invest if there's a deal?
Yeah, we've covered, but you've got two locations now. But I'm just saying that there's a long way from. So you're talking about goods going from Holyhead, for example, to Milton Keynes. Yeah, and from Dover to Milton Keynes.
If we think there's any risk to them.
Right. And how are you going to make sure that they get there?
How do we
Sounds
make sure?
Silly question, but
we have hired a logistics contractor that will move the goods. As is currently the situation, the HMRC has had an inland pre-clearance centre for.
So this is moving containers. You're talking about, not about.
We can move anything.
Sorry, so just be clear. Are you unloading these lorries then anywhere? Or
we would do.
So you'll unload them and then transport them to Milton Keynes.
If we wanted to.
if I might.
If we think there's a risk to it.
So physically,
But
where will you
Mr.
do that? So
Mr. Lincoln.
I mean, I might just say we do this collectively already. We have an inland facility where we jointly are currently doing a proportion of high-risk trade, which is in the centre of, is in the Midlands. So this is...
Something arrives at the port, your staff have a worry about it.
Yeah.
It then gets unpacked, put in something else. I mean, how do you do it?
So the logistics contractor will transport it to the inland clearance site, at which then it will be unpacked, and we will conduct the checks for security and other things as part of it. We'll look for prohibited and restricted items like firearms or drugs.
So in a sense, you've got the systems in place, but you just need more volume, and you've now got two extra additional places to do that. Okay, well that's interesting news. And in terms of redirecting freight generally, if there's a queue at one port or another, who is responsible for making sure that maybe freight is directed to another port? And can the container ports like Immingham, Tyne, others take in any of that row work? Have you planned for any of that, Ms. Wheeler?
I mean, obviously we are still very much working through what some possible options might be for dealing with the issues associated with capacity constraints, as Mr. Thompson described.
Yeah.
I mean, DFT, Department for Transport, will is leading the work associated with potential capacity and routing options that are being explored at the moment. Those haven't been agreed or decided yet, but they are being explored at the moment, and they will be working as well very closely with whatever local arrangements are in place as well. So we've been working very closely, for example, with the Kent Resilience Forum, which deals with planning and preparations for any issues that may arise at the channel ports as a result of freight getting held up.
But if there's a queue somewhere, a problem, who is making the ultimate call? Is it you, the border group? I mean, you're probably on the day, you're not going to be a gold group, are you? Who are making those judgments?
It's set out in the report. I think the NAO very helpfully gave you a diagram of the governance of this. You said, flicking back.
One thing, but it's the actual on the day who makes the decision. When you've got a large queue of that's really what I'm after.
So these are absolutely we're working through, because with Civil Contingencies Secretariat we're working through what some of these arrangements might look like. We would envisage this being between Department for Transport, but obviously others may well have a role to play in that, but that hasn't been agreed yet.
Mr. Chapman, and then I'm going to...
It's helpful to the rest of the committee. I'm looking at figure 6 in the Audit Office report. And these are the key system projects monitored by the Border Delivery Group. And obviously, big impact on how goods are moved in and out of the country across all these issues. Of the 12 categories, 1's amber green, 8 are amber red, 1's on amber and 2 on red. So this was taken last September. So given that we're 95% we're told 95% towards a deal at the moment, how confident are you that these issues will be resolved? How many will be green by next March?
I can't predict how many of these will be green. What we are trying to do is trying to make sure that where we have systems, at the moment we're working through all of these and identifying where we think we may need a contingency if the main system is not going to be, or is at risk of not being delivered. So we're working through a contingency for each of these, and we will be aiming, obviously, to ensure that at the very least the contingency will be green by the time that we need to implement it in March.
But to be clear, you shouldn't walk away from this rather helpful figure 6 thinking this is all about technology. I think if you read the summary position which is set out by the NAO on the right-hand side of this, 4 are about business readiness, 4 about technology, 2 are about legislation, 1 is about staff numbers, and 2 are about the negotiations and the setting of the policy, and 1 is about the practical arrangements should we re-accede to the Common Transit Convention. So they aren't necessarily... So when we talk about systems, it isn't just necessarily about the technology. It might be about, okay, the technology might be ready, but then it's the interaction of the business stuff.
Touch on some of those, talking which we're going to throw to Sir Geoffrey Brown on businesses.
So figure 7 shows us how interdependently all government departments work. But that figure is entirely predicated on the private sector being able to do the necessary customs checks and declarations. So why wasn't the private sector involved at a much earlier stage? We're now 26 months on from the referendum. Why wasn't it involved at a much earlier stage?
Much earlier stage of what?
Well, since the referendum.
Sorry, what are you asking me about deal or no deal? The committee keeps switching from one to the other.
I am talking about a no-deal scenario.
I'm talking about the wrong question. I'd like to put some clarity about whether people are about deal or no deal.
29th of March. We've got 145 to 250 traders that have got to make customs declarations that have never done so before.
Yes.
That is a massive task. You're only engaging with them in any level of detail now.
Correct.
Why wasn't that done much sooner?
Because this has made the delicate decision that their preferred outcome is to get a deal, and therefore, if you had a full engagement and transparency about what do you need to do in the event of no deal, that wasn't sending the right signal about striving for a deal. And that's the balance that ministers had to strike, and that's the balance ministers
deal. Let's be very clear. Is that doable? I mean, are those businesses going to be in a position to make the right declarations by 29th of March?
Some will and some won't.
And what will happen to the ones that don't? So the goods turn up at the ports, they haven't got adequate paperwork, the paperwork isn't correct, what will happen to them?
Yes, we were talking about that only this morning. So we've conceived of something called a managed transition, which is, so let's bring it to life. It's April the 9th, a Polish driver turns up, they haven't quite got the right piece of paperwork. What would we actually do at Dover in those situations? Ministers have been clear about their risk tolerance is, first of all, you let them into the United Kingdom, subject to the checks that Mr. Lincoln would normally carry out on your passport or your other forms of identification. Let that into the country. We'd identify which the business is not compliant, and we would try to help them to be compliant. But there would be a period, probably of several months, through which you would have to manage yourself to a situation where everyone understood what their obligations were. But that won't all be in place for April, and you cannot anticipate that all businesses will be ready for April 2019 under no deal.
So how long is suboptimal going to last? You talked about it being suboptimal here and I think elsewhere. How long is this suboptimal situation going to last?
Well, for most of what it is that we're having to deal with, a few months. But the ultimate system that we would like, which is the so-called inventory linking system, which would provide Mr. Lincoln and HMRC with significant amounts of additional data, that could take up to 3 years.
So I'm not quite clear on what you're saying. If I'm a small business and I turn up at the port, my paperwork is inadequate, are those goods going to be allowed through, or are they going to be sent back home?
Mr. Lincoln?
I think if we're talking about imports or exports, I think there are the two things.
Exports.
So exports will be a matter for whichever country those traders are going to. So it will be a matter for the French authorities if we're going through from Dover to Calais as to whether or not they would expect to turn those around. So hence why I think Mr. Thompson and Ms. Wheeler said that one of our biggest issues in terms of risk is the actions of member states in implementing controls.
Right. Let's flip the coin. Imports, which we can control. Have we made decisions on how the VAT charging regime is going to work on those imports yet?
So I would start with Mr. Thompson on that.
Yeah, the Chancellor, I think, set out some time ago, and I think there was subject to various questions, I think, from Caroline Flynn, about this question about the VAT quantum versus, it's not a quantum problem, it's a timing problem, and I think the Chancellor has made it clear that he would, in the event of no deal, legislate to, through secondary legislation, to change that on VAT, and the Partnership Pact sets out the VAT impact. And
you wrote to us on the 10th of this month, I think it was, saying that you will provide further details in due course. Obviously, it's a political decision ultimately to make the decision, but when do you think that due course will be? Because we're running out of time. When would you like it to be, perhaps, Mr. Thompson? When would you like to know this in order to be able to set up the system to deliver it?
Well, I think to give you the same answer that I've given several other select committees, the time to implement an optimal no-deal system has gone.
Okay, so you'll be running to catch up. So
final question. A few hearings ago, you told us the compliance costs to businesses, small businesses, were going to be 17 billion. You then gave us an update saying you didn't think it was going to be anything like that because two things would balance off each other. Where do you think the compliance cost, where do you think that figure is now?
I don't remember the second turn of that handle.
Sorry?
So I don't remember the second turn of that handle. The administrative cost of 200 million additional customs declarations.
No, 17 billion, you said.
And plus the tariffs.
Yes.
But I haven't moved from that position at all.
So there's still that figure still...
It's moved. It's must
but-
be high, isn't it?
Correct.
It still
I think you've had
pertains.
correct, Mr. Thompson, haven't you, because you raised that figure.
Yes.
So it's
But that's in the event of a no deal. Can we be absolutely clear? In the event of a deal,
Yes.
that figure falls away, doesn't it?
So in the event of a deal, our estimate is that it's £700 million a year, as opposed to the 17.5 billion to 19 billion.
Thank you very much.
now just Charlotte, I didn't know Anne-Marie Morris.
Okay. Technical notices, they've been released in groups of chunks. Have you had any feedback, Ms Moriarty?
Small number of queries from people about the technical notices, but relatively little direct feedback. But obviously they are the first tranche of information, and we're continuing to engage more directly, both in terms of regular discussions that we have with the key stakeholder groups, and also as we start then to put more flesh on the bones and give more detailed information of the sort that is in the partnership pack.
That we've had is, and I've read them, most of them, is they're not very helpful, as in they're all about doom and gloom and nothing about what anybody, government or the individual business concerned can do to resolve the issue. How are you going to now issue further notices that will help businesses not just understand the problem, but will actually give them some guidance as to what you're going to do to help them and what they can do to help themselves?
So that is the process that we are engaged in, of going from the technical notices, which were about just sort of setting out as a starting point, this is what we think the position will be, and moving from that to the guidance that says, these are the sorts of things that you will need to do. So that's work. We have a planned programme over the next few weeks of providing that information in order to allow people to make the changes that they need to. There are in terms of things that people need to do differently, and there are different timescales for what people need to do. So what we're trying to do is to plot the issuing of the guidance against the timescales when people need to take action.
Do you have a full plan as to what's going to be issued when, and what's the last date you'll be issuing anything?
We are... I couldn't tell you off the top of my head what is the last date at which we will be issuing guidance. We have, as I said when I came last time, we have put in place a new directorate specifically in order to pull together and act as the owner of the plan. I don't know whether we've got the plan yet to the level of granularity of exactly what we're going to issue on each day, but that is definitely, that's what we're moving towards.
Moriarty, we're looking here really about risk and crisis management. Can you write to us telling us what exactly the plan is when you know what the plan is, which I hope will be in the next week?
I wouldn't guarantee it will be in the next week, but I will certainly write to you within the next week to tell you when I think what we will have.
Okay, did you have any questions for Mr Thompson on Sunday?
Mr Thompson, you've been left out of this.
I'm happy with that.
Ms Morris on the case. Ms Morris.
In a sense, for you, the issue of crisis management and the issue of risk planning, we've heard an awful lot of problems. We've heard that flow and security are the most important things as against other risks. Flow and risk conflict, because giving more flow probably will give rise to more risk. How are you going to square the circle, Mr Thompson?
So I think ministers have been relatively transparent that you've got the three objectives of the flow of trade, the security of the United Kingdom, and revenue risk, and that revenue risk would be deprioritised. That is where ministers would take the risk, and I think the Treasury Minister has made that public.
Right, so on technical notices, this is going to be clarified, is it?
Technical
so I know
notices.
this has been technical notices. Certainly, ministers have made this clear at committees.
What technical notices do businesses need in order to comply? Is that what you're asking?
To be honest, I think Ms Moriarty had dealt with most of my questions, and I'm hoping in the written response I'll get most of what I need.
So on customs, the answer to Claire would have been in the partnership pack. It does include a section that says things you can do now. you should consider now the effect of no deal exit on your business, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and gives people a guide of the things that they could do now if they wished to. And it runs through different sectors, so businesses and agents or freight forwarders and so on. It gives different lists according to where you might feature in the landscape of the border industry.
Okay, and would we be correct in assuming you're not monitoring what they actually do?
Correct.
I thought so. Thank you, Chairman.
Gareth Snell.
Mr Thompson, very briefly on trade remedies. When the United Kingdom leaves next March, if we leave in a way that is no deal, what legal authority will there be to impose trade remedy tariffs on goods like steel and ceramics?
So it will be for the government to consider and publish its position on that. The lead department is the Department for International Trade, working with the Treasury, and it's connected to the question of what tariffs would the UK adopt under the WTO rules. My understanding is that tariffs and remedies need to be the same for all countries until you either until you're either in a customs union or you strike a free trade agreement, at which point you can vary both ways. But those are the two lead departments.
In terms of, because the trade remedy works by calculating the injury margin of a non-market economy status good into the UK, the investigations that determine what that remedy tariff may look like are lengthy. What work is your department, the HMRC, doing with DIT and BEIS and the Treasury to try and do some of that preparative work now to ascertain what sort of levies may be necessary, or is that just something that's not actually being thought about at the moment?
So I need to be careful. I have seen the papers which have been drawn up by the Department for International Trade, but I don't think they've yet been formally considered by ministers.
And then finally, Chair, in terms of the necessary infrastructure from your department, in terms of collecting the duty or tariff that's due on a good that's subject to a trade remedy, does that require additional infrastructure in your systems, or is that something you can simply bolt on to any tariffs that may be due under any particular trade deal that already exists?
So the current system, the Customs Handling Import and Export Facility, which you're fully familiar with at some considerable length, currently handles the common external tariff plus 44 variants to that tariff because of free trade agreements struck by the EU, plus any trade remedy further variants to that. So Chief handles it now, and we think could handle it in the future, because if we can implement CDS, which I may not get to at some point in this conversation.
How long does it take to adjust? To do it in?
So I'm told it takes 7 hours for somebody to load up the 17,500 additional tariffs that you require.
7 hours. Okay.
That's what I'm told. I went and visited the team in Southend, and that's what I was told.
With everything else,
but the primary, to be clear to, I'm sorry, I can't quite see your name, to Mr. Snell's question, the primary departments are the Department for International Trade and the Treasury to set what are both the trade remedies and defence, and what might be our common tariffs in the United Kingdom.
And I apologise if this is not an area of your own responsibility, but the investigation into trade remedy or potential tariffs on dumped tableware and tiles is currently ongoing, but it will not be concluded until after the 29th of March within the European Union. From your own working practices, if we leave with a deal that maintains us in a transitionary period, would you expect simply to roll over those particular new trade remedies from the EU even after our exit day, or would you be expecting to have to implement potentially British determined trade remedies, which could be different because of the methodology?
I'm sorry, I could not answer the question, but I'm happy to try and write.
Okay. Thank you. Can I just pick up on a couple of other things? Earlier you were talking about the VAT imports, and you said you're beyond the point where it's impossible to implement everything, but how long would it take from a political decision to postpone accounting for import VAT on goods to implementing the system? How long will it actually take you to deliver that system?
Well, there's a preceding decision that there's a secondary decision that you have to make in the event of no deal, which is do you also wish to proceed with making tax digital for business on VAT, which comes in on the same day? So ministers are aware of that.
Okay, so
it is my opinion that you'd have to pick one or the other.
Right. Okay. And how long would it take then to implement it once the decision's been made?
On
the VAT,
So
postponing accounting for VAT on imports.
I'm informed by the team that you could do one or the other, but not both on the same day.
Okay, so you could do one on the same day. Do you know how much revenue will be foregone? Because obviously there'll be a delay in you getting that VAT in. Have you done a calculation on that? Or an estimate on that? So
the difference with the government and the issue which was raised by businesses is not a quantum issue, it's a cash flow problem. So there would be.
So you will get the money in eventually, but you will have a cash flow challenge which could have an impact on for the government.
There would be a cash flow impact for the government. I haven't seen a quantification of that because it's with the Treasury, but I could attempt to find that.
I think quite significant given the progress that HMRC is making in collecting in that tax to pay for public services. And then on the technical notices, we've had a lot of concerns from members around the House from their local businesses. Have you had feedback on how well they're being received and any plans to improve them?
We've had significantly less feedback than we anticipated when we published the 3 technical notices, one for customs, one for excise and one for VAT. Therefore, when we published the partnership pack last week, it specifically asked for feedback and a dedicated line, an email that says what else would help, which we'll then consider as we go along in terms of improving the pack. We anticipate there would be multiple versions of the pack which would add to the feedback that we get. But to be transparent with you, that was published last Wednesday and it opened the door to tell us what else would help, and we'll try to provide more information as we go.
Less than a week ago. What about you, Ms Moriarty?
Likewise, I mean, we stood up some capacity to make sure that we could receive, if people got in touch with us on the back of publication of the technical notices, we didn't have much take up on that. I think probably because, as we were discussing earlier, the technical notices themselves are the starting point for the communications that people are keen to see, which is what do I need to do now?
I've had contact around the House, as most of their businesses saying, I don't have what I need to have at the moment. It sounds like you're aware of that. So. We've touched on how long that will take to deliver. Now, just move on to the very knotty issue of Northern Ireland. I think when you came in front of us the last time we tried to discuss this, Mr Thompson, you said it wasn't in the border planning group at that point. Now it clearly is in your remit. And what are you currently able to do in terms of planning for a no deal for Northern Ireland?
Well, very little other than that which is published in the government's document of June 2018, where the UK rejected the EU's proposition and put itself the temporary customs arrangement on the table. I mean, I could set out what the temporary customs arrangement
There's a lot of talk
says.
about technological approaches to avoiding a hard border, but what feasibly and practically could you do to have a customs arrangement, to support a customs or implement a customs arrangement without a hard border?
The Prime Minister has said on multiple occasions there will be no hard border, and our interpretation of that is no infrastructure at the border. That's what we mean by hard border. We set out previously in the summer of 2017 what our thoughts were for putting in an administrative process that does not require checks. Now that of course was overtaken by the development of the white paper, but it would include you have a high level of IT risking rules, which is currently in the system. 98% or thereabouts of customs declarations go through. You then try to do anything as far as you could away from the actual border, so the inland pre-clearance centres that we have now, and we're expanding. Now in Northern Ireland, what was added onto that in the summer of 2017 was the idea of a derogation for small and medium-sized enterprises because of the local economy. Our position has not moved on from that, and which was stated by the government in June 2018.
And how far advanced are other plans around APNR, about tracking known criminals, and because there's cooperation with the police either side of the border, there are other issues. Have you got into those yet, and have you got time to deliver anything in that respect?
To be clear again, you're still asking me about Ireland and Northern Ireland. So
yes,
as a customs administrator, we have consistently said we do not require any infrastructure at the border, which includes any of the things that you quoted.
So you won't have any number plate catching either side of the border. You might have that either side of the border because you have cameras, Northern Ireland, but different bits of the system will have cameras collecting information, CCTV, the PSNI, the guards, Guard Chicana.
I mean, I can only reiterate what you've heard me say on multiple occasions. It is not our intention as a customs administration to erect any infrastructure at all.
Won't erect. Will you be using other people's infrastructure that's already in place outside the border? So you won't be asking to see CCTV or use automatic number plate recognition. No. So how are you going to stop people from trying to smuggle? There have always been problems about smuggling, for example, fuel across the border, other things. It's not been a problem that's gone away, even with the EU. How are you going to make sure that doesn't happen then? If you're not even going to use other people's infrastructure. I mean, it happens now with an open border, quite openly. It's not like we're not talking about hard borders. We're talking about cooperation. Already.
I'm sorry, probably deeply unsatisfactory for you, but the government's position was that we rejected the EU's proposition that proposed a temporary customs arrangement of no tariffs, no quotas, no rules of origin, a single phytosanitary area, a common travel area, and negotiations remain ongoing. If the government's position moves on from that, then the government will make it clear.
Okay, well, if we have no hard... I can recognise it's challenging. That's why it hasn't been resolved yet. So no hard border and no customs arrangement, which means you still have to monitor what's going across the border, but without the hard border. So how are you going to do that?
So in the summer of 2017, we set out that for small and medium-sized enterprises, we would argue for a derogation.
I'll explain that in detail.
For those businesses above the derogation, we would try to maximise a self-assessment and trusted trader scheme. And for businesses that we can get into that category, then that means that checks would take place at their premises, which is relatively commonplace in the UK economy.
In the event of a no deal, we would crash out. There would be a border that would need the EU would expect it to be maintained. And what are your plans? What would you have to practically do in the event of a no deal?
I think I just answered this question.
I'm pushing hard, but I'm not getting very far. I mean, the Northern Ireland Audit Office has done a brief assessment of the plan, raised a number of concerns, which I won't go into, but including around business that goes across the border automatically, which I think is above your threshold of small businesses. And they consider, the Auditor General there, Mr Donnelly, considers that Northern Ireland is not fully ready and lacks time to implement any required changes in the event of a no deal. Do you agree with that, Mr Thompson?
I thought the UK border, how prepared is Northern Ireland for exit in the European Union, that was published last month by the Northern Ireland Audit Office, was a rather good explanation of the 7 key risks that were faced.
Right, so you agree with the risks? And is there anything you think you can do to help mitigate those?
Well, there is striking a deal.
Well, there we go. That's above. I guess you can actually legitimately say on this one that is above your pay grade. Over to the Prime Minister on that one. And do you think there's anything that could be done to improve communication with businesses in Northern Ireland about the risks, because they are right at the front line of these challenges?
Yes, we're in a very difficult political environment to do that.
Check that. Okay, on which point we'll have to leave that, I think, and move to Caroline Flint. Over to you, Ms. Flint.
Thank you, Chair. I've read through the transcript of the Home Affairs Select Committee last week, so I'm not going to go through some of that territory, but I do want to pick up on a few issues that came out of that in relation to the Border Force. Mr Lincoln, perhaps you could just start by just clarifying for me the estimates of the staff that are going to be required, because I think we've heard before that something like 2,000 would have to be recruited in the event of no deal. And in some areas of the NAO report, and certainly what was reported back to the Home Affairs Select Committee the other week, that seems to have reduced to 581. Could you just clarify those statistics and be clear about whether they are in terms of no deal or a deal? That would be really helpful. Thank you.
So, I'll do my best to clarify. The government set out a while back that it was going to recruit a 300-strong readiness task force, which was going to be used for a no-deal scenario, and it was going to be used for 2 primary purposes. The first was allow us to take staff from the front line to be allowed to do face-to-face training to prepare them for any situation which EU exit might provide. The second thing which it does is provide us with a mobile reserve of people who are trained in a range of different activities across border forces professionalisms, we can use those as a contingency. Beyond that, then we are recruiting around about 600 additional staff, which are being used to do a combination of different things. If you think about the uncertainty, which you've had, the report mentions the uncertainty, we took a sort of pragmatic approach which tried to balance, I think, a number of different factors. One of which was known requirements on border force from other government departments. Another was making sure that we had resilience and developing requirements, putting in place sufficient people for that. We also, of course, needed to think about what was the operational resilience in terms of the mobile reserve I just talked about. There's a question, I think, about individuals, and because some of these things are location-specific, we need to be quite clear about how we're treating individuals. And the fifth thing which we were concerned about was value for money. So in looking at those 600, those are the factors which we were taking into account as our part of our recruitment. Now, there may be a question here, I think.
Just pause you there for a moment. So, talking about the 300, that group, which I think is up at now around, what is it? Is it? It's got quite high in terms of that group. What's the figure for that?
284, I think it is in place by the end of the year.
But you mentioned the 300, 600. Where does that fit in relation to the 2,000?
So the 2,000 was the estimate which we worked through based on HMRC's data about the potential checks we might need to do, originally in a sort of no deal or a maximum facilitation model, which of course was a previous model, which would need to be put in place over time, recognising, as Mr Thompson said earlier, that it would take some years to put in place the systems and the infrastructure to have a completely functioning border in the most optimal state. So that 2,000 was the highest possible number which we were thinking about being on a route to achieve after a couple of years post a day one no-deal scenario, if that's where we got to. Hence why the numbers which you see are significantly lower than that. There was a question of 624, which I think the report mentions, and that was our initial estimate which we worked through with HMRC as to the likely number of people we would need to do checks. That was then, as we continually refine our assessments, that was brought down to the 581, which is in the report.
So that 2,000 figure has been reassessed and basically it's been reduced. Okay. So one of the points that the NAO make in the report, which is interesting about the numbers here, that a sense that you haven't been provided with enough information from other departments to help you plan your staffing requirements. What was the problem there?
I mean, I think, as I said, there's been quite a lot of uncertainty in the original start to this, but we've worked very closely since with departments. The report, I think, notes that I wrote to government departments back in February to look at making sure that we were trying to finalise that. We have got finalised positions, with the exception of Northern Ireland, which we have just talked about. On most of the outstanding issues, we have a few detailed operational things to work through with some departments.
You feel reassured now that you're getting the information you need to plan?
Yes.
There isn't anything more with Mr Thompson, Ms Moriarty here and Karen Wheeler that you'd like to put into the public domain where they can help you more?
As I said, we're now just working through the detailed operational planning of some of those issues.
Okay. Now, in terms of the recruitment, and obviously there was quite a lot of detail at the Home Affairs Select Committee last week about the time it takes, and particularly compared to, say, HMRC, you've got security checks that HMRC doesn't have to apply to. But there does still seem to be quite a long process in terms of getting people through the recruitment process, but even then, in terms of offering people jobs, them giving notice, but also of the people who are offered jobs, there's quite a relatively, I would suggest, low number that are actually then accepting the offers. What's the problem there?
If I just take a step back to the different factors which we were balancing here, one of those is trying to make sure that we had sufficient time available to us to advertise those jobs. We said we were going to create a pipeline for a series of different requirements, but we're also quite conscious that we need to take account of individual needs. One of the things which prevented us from offering jobs as early as we would have liked to in this process was finalising some of those requirements. Some of them are particularly location sensitive, and what we don't want to do is offer a job to somebody and then say to them, we want you now to work in a different location. So that's one of the reasons why that's taking place. Beyond that, the Home Office currently has an 84-stage process, which it's working hard to reduce, and it's working, as I think I said, to the Home Affairs Select Committee with the Government Chief People Officer to try and reduce that. We've also put in place a more centralised recruitment process, and we are working very hard We now have a significant number of fast-track places through security clearance, which reduces the amount of time it takes.
Have you been able to do anything in the last year in terms of retention of staff? Obviously, some people will leave by retirement, but if there have been any issues about why people are leaving the service, to hold on to them?
The report, I think, says 450 people left in the course of the previous year. 150 of those, roughly, were retirement. We are, of course, looking at what does it mean overall, but the numbers of border force officers leaving, probably one of the lowest levels of churn and attrition in the whole of government.
Okay. Now, how do you feel in terms of coming up to the 29th of March that you will have the staff in place that you need? What's your what causes you most concern about that, or not, as the case may be?
Well, we don't normally give a running commentary of numbers. The committee will know we normally publish this once a year, but we recognise it's slightly unusual times. So the baseline we had for the average in the previous year was at March was at 7,734. I said at the committee last week that at the end of September we were on 8,190, so it's about 450, 460 additional people, which already takes account of the attrition in the system as we build through, and that means that we're projecting to be on a pathway for around about 8,600, which is around about the 900 which we were requiring. Now, we're not complacent about this. The report does say that there is a risk that we might not achieve that, so we've put a number of additional contingencies in place just in case. I should also say, before going to those contingencies, the report also notes that the demands on us on a day one no deal are likely to be fewer than the number of people which we are actually recruiting for. So we have built some resilience into the number of people that we're recruiting for. But we do have options for going beyond that, so we routinely... so there is, in terms of working that through, there's probably somewhere between about 50 and 100 people in terms of the resilience in that. Which is a conservative estimate. Beyond that, as I said, there is our 300 mobile task force, which we can deploy. We also have options, as ever, for seasonal workforce. We have a pool of 700 seasonal workforce, which we routinely draw people from. Beyond that, we have used immigration enforcement officers, which we very successfully did last summer, to help support us in the key demand areas at airports. And beyond that, we also have draw on the HMRC Operational Reserve, which again we very successfully used during the summer. So we have a whole series of different contingencies which we can draw upon if we were not to meet that number. But we're pretty confident of reaching the overall requirement.
How are you going to ensure that EU exit work does not divert you from undertaking other parts of the work you do, which is important, for example, just checking passports?
We already do 100% checks on all scheduled arrivals into the UK. We will continue to do that. We already do 100% checks of all the vehicles in terms of lorries which come in through the short straits at Dover or through the tunnel, including using our passive millimetric wave technology. We also use the dogs 100% around those lorries. They're one of our most successful tools for finding, for example, illegal immigrants coming into the country. We will continue to do all those security checks.
The chair's asked me, that's a stage
are you
whisper from
recruiting?
this side.
Yes,
how many dogs have we got, and are we getting any more?
So my recollection is that we have over 100 dogs. Some of those are provided by a contract called Wagtail, and the others are ones which we own.
How can you recruit more dogs? Is that something that's possible? Yeah. So are you recruiting more dogs?
So we review our need for dogs on a regular basis.
Yeah. I just wonder how long that...
We do also have dogs who retire.
So in terms of obviously passport checks, obviously operations to identify smuggling and on all of that, you feel that that's all under control?
We continue to do all those things which we do now. There's no
displacement activity from
there's
any
no
of that
reason
work.
not to do that. If there were displacement, then we're working on contingency plans with immigration enforcement, for example, on potential displaced routes.
Okay. Can I just maybe move on then to obviously the announcement by the Chancellor on the e-gate situation, extending it to Canada, America, Australia and New Zealand. And I noticed from the exchange last week that I think you identified, Mr. Lincoln, somewhere over 6 million to make use of the e-gates as a result. Given that there has been raised some concerns sometimes about e-gates not being fully utilised and problems, but also you still have to have personnel alongside where there are issues that crop up. How are you going to cope with that extension?
I think I put this in context that there are around about 9.5 million people who are colloquially known as the B5J, Borders 5 and Japan. And we estimate, therefore, around about 6 million would benefit from the use of the e-gates, bearing in mind restrictions on children who are under the age of 12 and the need for a biometric passport. We have done modelling of the implications, how that works through. The e-gates themselves are 99+% reliable. I think the question which I normally get asked is why aren't all of the e-gates open all of the time? And that is to do with officer deployment. It is more efficient for us to deploy officers to the non-EEA queues, which is where the particular issues around time are, versus having people to monitor the e-gates. So with a fixed resource, then you take a process. We are meeting our service level agreement for EEA throughout. We know that we have not met throughout our non-EEA, which is the 45 minutes target, 95% of 45 minutes. And we also know that this will transform the journey for about 6 million passengers coming into the country.
Do you think it will increase or decrease the amount of time that staff have to spend at that point of entry? And also, do you think it will have a lessening effect on the impact of queues?
So for my staff, then the key thing there is that there will be fewer people who they have to examine physically, allow them to look at the people who are in higher risk cohorts, and that is a more effective use of their time.
Next, I'd like to go on to some of the issues around security at the border and access to the tools that we currently have. And there was some substantial discussion about this at the Home Affairs Select Committee last week. And I noticed that you did say to my colleague Stephen Doherty that you were going to... No, actually it was to the Chair, Yvette Cooper, when she asked about mitigating the risks and access to information. You did say, I think it would probably be better for me to come back to the committee on that. Since last week, what more have you got to say about, if you suddenly find that you haven't got access, I think, is it SIS or SIS, do we call it? SIS2. I know there was a bit of an exchange between yourself and Mr Thompson about customs data. Let's put that to one side. But reflecting on last week's evidence you gave, is there something more you'd like to say to clarify the situation?
I think I said at the time, we are working through a whole series of mitigations against the potential loss of tools. We don't do all of our targeting by any means by the use of EU tools alone. We work with bilateral and other fora to take that forward. And there are some future opportunities in data. Mr Thompson mentioned earlier that on goods that there will be opportunities there. But we do recognise there are issues associated with the loss of some of these law enforcement tools.
Or no, that the Home Office is to agreeing continued access to those EU security tools?
Well, this is one of those areas where the Prime Minister has made very clear that we will unconditionally offer our support to Europe, because the safety of Europe and the safety of the UK is intertwined in this respect.
And if there's no deal, how much will you have to rethink what you prioritise in terms of security at the border?
So we will continue to prioritise security as we do now. So effectively, we are there to do two things. To stop bad people and bad things coming in effectively, and to support and facilitate the flow of legitimate travellers and goods. So we will continue to do that.
Given that earlier in the session today, I think my colleague Sir Geoffrey mentioned about how there'll be a number of people, not very nice people, potentially looking for a moment where they might be able to boost their criminal activity and, as criminal entrepreneurs in their own field. If we look at something like Operation Paladin, which clearly was set up to expertise for children at risk in terms of human smuggling, what thought is being given to some of those operations and trying to ensure that any cracks or gaps that might appear are closed or not even allowed to open in the first place?
So when it comes to thinking about children, of course, we do have a duty care under the legislation, and we take that very seriously. We do a number of intensification operations to do that. That's as much think about targeting high-risk flights or other forms of travel. It doesn't always rely on intelligence to do so. We also have people who are very skilled at behavioural detection. Some of our best finds actually are from our officers who will rove or meet flights and using those skills to identify people who may be subject to modern slavery or trafficking, and we have a very good success rate in doing that.
Could you maybe identify, because I think it's quite useful for people to have a context of how much of this criminal activity comes via the EU as opposed to outside the EU? What trends and what countries are giving you most concerned about this sort of illegal activity?
Well, if you were to just look at the numbers of foreign national offenders that we have in the country, we've removed in the last year, broadly speaking, 6,000 of those were removed last year, and of those 2/3 roughly were from the EU.
Right, so it's a big, with free movement, is there any been analysis been done of the impact of free movement aiding this sort of activity?
So we do analysis of the implication of the tools. We routinely update our analysis as we go forward.
And presumably you're feeding some of that into, hopefully coming soon, the government's new white paper on immigration.
So the immigration minister was responding to an urgent question in the House earlier. I think she set out a statement regarding to that will be set out in due course.
And my final question really is, obviously ourselves and other committees are very focused on a no-deal situation. I don't necessarily want to go through you all, but maybe Karen, as in terms of coordinating the group. How much are you also thinking about a deal and using the implementation time post a deal in a good and effective way to make sure that we take advantage, hopefully, of a better situation to plan services going forward?
Well, we're probably, as a coordination group around borders, doing less work than is happening in individual departments around a deal. And the reason for that is we tend to see a deal as it can either have customs and controls at the border or not. If it has customs and controls around the border, which is not currently the proposed or expected deal scenario, but if it did, it would be quite like the no-deal scenario, although we would have 2 more years to plan for it, and therefore more time to put in place the systems that we need and the infrastructure that we need. And obviously we are doing a lot of work on making sure that we can understand, progress and plan for both those systems and those infrastructure, because they will apply in a no deal or a deal where we may have customs controls. Where there is a scenario where we have no customs controls or other sorts of controls, which is what was envisaged under Chequers, then, to be honest, there isn't a huge amount in comparison for the borders team to worry about, because frankly most of the work that we are doing is around the changes in all of the border locations with the EU, and those will not change if we don't have customs and other agri-food and other controls. There will be changes for traders at rest of the world ports, so it won't be completely tiny amounts of change, but much less. We've started to identify that work, but obviously a lot more work is going on in individual departments.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Can I just ask about this 84-stage recruitment process Mr. Lincoln just described? Mr. Thompson, some of your staff have pretty hard frontline jobs where they've got, I guess, warrant powers and so on. How many stages are there in HMRC's recruitment process for the staff with the strongest arrest powers or warrant powers?
I'll admit for once I don't know the answer to that question, but
anywhere near 84?
I
saw your eyes rolling. That's why
I was impressed, I have to say, with Mr. Lincoln's grasp of 84 stages. Look, I mean, as I said last week, HMRC did a full process strip down of recruitment, and we got it down to 4 months from advert to start.
Okay, so maybe Mr. Lincoln is something that Home Office could learn from HMRC.
And we have said we're working with the government chief principal officer, which also takes account of HMRC's good
It's just a bit worrying that this is only just happening. And Ms. Moriarty, you've got likewise, you've got people, inspectors, people who've got very important frontline roles. How many stages do they have to go through?
So, to be honest, on a like-for-like basis, I don't know, because it depends what you count as a stage. I mean, like other people, we have been looking at how we make the process as streamlined as possible.
You outsource a lot of it to other agencies, though, in a sense, that use some of the work.
Although we would see the recruitment process as being broadly similar across our agencies.
Well, maybe there's a bit of work for PAC to look at recruitment processes and how many stages they've got. Can I just ask, before I ask Marie Morris to come in, if you, Mr. Thompson, Ms. Moriarty, Mr. Lincoln indeed, have the money you need to deliver for either deal or no deal?
We're negotiating for next year. I think we're all negotiating for next year.
But for the end of the financial year?
So we had 262 million, I think, and we'll pretty much spend it all, or possibly even a shade more than that. Next year, for no deal, we've asked for 400 million, and for deal, it's a bit more than that, 430.
Okay, Ms Moriarty.
So
you didn't get as much as you wanted last time, did you, when you asked?
We didn't get as much as we wanted last time, but we are managing to the budget that we have, and we think that we're expecting to come in about on that budget for 2018-19. We are to some extent, because we're moving people, the cost of the people is the same, and what we're doing is trading off exactly what they're doing and how fast we move on other areas. We are likewise in negotiation with the Treasury about funding for next year.
Mr Lincoln talked about having a contingency group of staff. You've each got, I know you've got special teams. How much of that is contingency? I mean, you're going to manage, Ms Moriarty, you said, because you've got a budget from what you want.
So what we're doing at the moment, as part of putting a kind of 3-month, what we call a no-deal sprint, so we have moved quite a few people temporarily from their normal jobs into our EU exit area to make sure that we can deliver faster with higher delivery confidence, and while also thinking about people's well-being, so that in some areas we are doubling up people and posts to provide extra resilience.
So you do have your supernumerary in a sense at the moment?
Well, we are, and as I say, we are trading off in order to make sure we can get ourselves into a sensible position. If we move into a full-blown no-deal preparation in the new year, then we will need to identify more people to. We're not currently staffing a full-on incident management response.
You, Mr Thompson. We may have covered all this.
We don't have a contingency, but we do host the Surge and Rapid Response Team, which is the function that Paul calls, which is 400 people in. That moves around government departments where there are peaks in workload. So they did a lot of work at the Home Office on Windrush. They regularly deploy in the summer for the border forces.
They put in previous. Mr Snell, briefly, and then I'm going to come
just
around.
Without wishing to put you on the spot, how much will all of you breathe a sigh of relief if before Christmas Parliament actually votes on a deal and accepts it? Because it sounds to me that actually your job becomes immeasurably easier, not easy, easier, if we have a deal that gives you that 2-year window to actually plan for the end of the transition period.
If it was that clean,
Is it on? Are you writing to Santa?
if it was that clean, then it would be easier.
Let's go back. When you mentioned your figures, Mr Thompson, just replaying them in my head, you seem to say a higher figure if you have a deal than no deal. Was that right?
So for us, I think uniquely in Whitehall, implementing BrExit becomes narrower in scope. So some of the systems which are on figure 6 in the report completely fall away, but we're left with implementing the facilitated customs arrangement, which is technologically unique.
And challenging. You've been, sometimes we learn more from what you don't say than what you do. Ms Morris.
Mr Thompson, assuming there's no deal, what emergency legislation are you planning, and at what point would you start trying to get that through the House?
So we would not require any primary legislation. We have the Taxation Cross-Border Trade Act on the statute books now. We require 48 statutory instruments, 30 on customs, 13 on VAT and 5 on excise to implement leaving the European Union, and we are evaluating how many additional would we require for no deal. We think it would be a small number, single figures, in addition to the 48.
Okay, so at what point are you going to decide no deal practically is where we are, so you start looking at getting this delegated legislation through?
When Cabinet gives us a clear signal that that's what we're required to do.
You're going to wait, and so if the Cabinet don't give it to you until the day before the 29th of March, you're just going to sit there and...
Well, ministers are fully aware of the risks that are being run here.
Ms Moriarty, in terms of emergency legislation.
Well, so for no deal legislation, we have got 85 statutory instruments which we are progressing. We're putting them through, and the fisheries bill, which is now in Parliament, is part of our no deal. I think if by emergency legislation you mean you know, sort of contingency legislation. At the moment, we don't have any plans to introduce emergency legislation. But as the that's something which would have to be looked at in the round as part of the work that's being done on preparing for No Deal, and particularly the work led by the Civil Contingencies Secretariat.
Crisis management plan.
We do, yes.
And how worked up is that?
Like all plans, it exists. Different elements of it exist at different levels of granularity, and it is a plan that will never be finished, because as soon as you get to one level, you then need to move to the next. You then take each level and play it out more.
Given we're looking at potentially a no deal scenario, when does that crisis management plan come into place? Or are you going to sit like Mr Thompson and wait for the ministers to tell you that you can start implementing?
Well, some of it we're implementing now, and that is, that's the nature of the work that we did earlier in the year to identify what contingencies we would need to implement if we moved into a no deal scenario. Some of that we are now doing. So, for example, we talked when we came before about marine enforcement. If we are not in a no deal situation, there is no need for any marine enforcement. So a number of our project areas are specifically the contingency planning. So the work we're doing for export health certificates, the speed to which we are running our import notification system. So there's a whole lot of areas of our current planning which are specifically about no deal contingency planning. Business readiness is the additional element where, as I was saying earlier, so we now need to make sure that the various people in different sectors understand what they will need to do. So we're working through all of that, and bringing together and kind of constantly refining plans.
A lot of legislation to go through from all departments, which is outside your how it's ordered and how it's organised and gone through, and what time frame is outside your control.
Yeah.
Okay, can I thank you both all very much indeed for coming and giving evidence. Possibly the next time we see you, we may have a decision by Parliament, but you never know. We live in hope outstrips reality too often in this instance, I think. But the transcript, as ever, will be up on the website in the next couple of days. Thank you for your time.